Hello, this is your host, Todd Lowe's, the Press Fly Podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. You can support me on Subscribestar, buy me a coffee, and locals. And as per usual, super chats we read first from the chat, if there are any, and so on and so forth. So today's episode is the 83rd Casual Stream, Socialism as a Right-Wing Reaction to Capitalism. So this is a spicy idea that I've been working on for a while, independently of a man who is called George Watson, who put together a book called The Lost Literature of Socialism. And he has this little introductory introductory essay to this concept, which is really, really important and interesting. So I'm going to read a little bit of him here. He says, I want to ask here why, in defiance of the evidence, the name of socialism still sounds benevolent, why its Tory and reactionary traditions, explicit as they once were, have been so soundly forgotten, and why there are still parties that preserve the name when the thing itself is widely rejected even by its disciples. One reason is that the scriptures of socialism are little read even by specialists, and the evasion has had its costs. People simply do not know what, in its heyday, the idea was about. The heyday, which stretched for a century or so, from the 1840s, gave rise to a mountain of prose, Marx and Engels, Ruskin and Morris, Wells and Shaw, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, which is now seen, not without reason, as boring, if not actively embarrassing, and lies largely unregarded. Any account of socialist racialism, for example, produces blank incredulity or indignation. It seems fair to suspect that socialists do not dare to read the writings of their pioneers, and their opponents, more surprisingly, do not read them either. I had no idea Marx went as far as that, Isaiah Berlin once remarked when I produced evidence for his genocidal ideas. Though his excellent little book, Karl Marx, 1939, critical as it was of the subject, had by then passed through several editions. Socialism led a charmed life as a world because hardly anyone studies what it once said. Now, this is really important. His work and then some of my own independent studies. The first thing is, when you read enough history, you sort of realize, at least from the terms of what we might call general sources or tertiary sources. So, just any sort of general introduction to the Middle Ages, right? Those aren't primary sources. Those aren't even secondary sources. But they're useful to sort of get a scaffolding or skeleton of history as you read it. I'm like, okay, well, this is the skeleton or scaffolding of history. And I realized that prior to 1917, there's like hardly any discussion of anything about socialism as an ideology, even though we know we have even proto-socialist writers as early as like 1800, some of them being anarchists. And it's like, well, okay, so we have like basically 115 years of theorizing. And we don't, you hear about Marx, but you hear about Marx from a perspective. See, this is what I've realized throughout history. It's not just the people who don't like you that mischaracterize you. It's even your own supporters. So for a classic example would be the right mischaracterizes Marx when he says that heroism is dead. History repeats itself first as tragedy, then as farce. That's taken to mean that Marxism is anti-heroic. Marx is not saying that he thinks the death of heroism is a good thing. He's saying that within the capitalist context, that's what happens. And he's referring to some French Revolution, one of the many revolutions after the first one. But also Marxist supporters get Marx wildly wrong. Many of his objections to capitalism sound downright reactionary. And in fact, both Marx and Engels, certainly Engels at least, admitted the indebtedness of their concept of the cash nexus to the arch-reactionary Thomas Carlyle. And in fact, they were very favorable of Carlyle, I think in part because they saw him as a capitalist critic and a sophisticated one at that, even if they didn't agree with all of his other theories about the world. And so you get this weird perspective where both sides get him wrong because they just don't read him. Even when almost everybody's read the Communist Manifesto. And I'll read some excerpts from there that really sort of challenge convention on this. But I'm like, okay, well, why is that? Because there's obviously the pro-Western socialist Marxist position, which I've grown up with, we've all grown up with it, and it's evolved into the woke. Many people thereby conflate that with socialism and Marxism itself. Well, so Marxism narrowly and socialism more broadly. The problem is that I don't think that's a very effective way to go about it. So first of all, I won't go into the details because I've already done it elsewhere. But I think basically there were two strands of socialism. Well, maybe even just one, but broadly speaking, two. And the second strand was what we would call, using the concept of synthetic left, which I take from Caleb Maupin, is the idea these are unreal socialists. These are intentional plants or corrupted elements by the capitalist class to have them advocate for policies diametrically opposed to the goal of socialism. So there's a lot to get into, but I'm going to first start with theory, right? So if your goal is to overthrow the capitalist class, which is what all socialists throughout all of history have said their, quote, goal was, even though many didn't get very close to that goal, there's certain things you have to understand. There's certain things that you would, if you were actually organizing a full effort against this system, that you'd have to do. So basically, minimally, we can say that what this system is it's using the state to externalize the costs of merchant activity onto everyone else. So throughout all of history, the merchants generally got a bad rap. They were considered generally a little better than prostitutes. And this is something that Murray Rothbard complains about in his History of Economics. Well, yeah, because there's a lot of economic activity that has very deleterious externalities to people that aren't directly involved in the exchange. Throughout most of history, the state stepped in and said, you just can't do that. Beginning in, say, the 13th century, 14th century, with the rise of Italian city-states and the Hanseatic League, states around Europe began to protect the merchants and allow them to externalize their costs into the future and onto the present through the use of force. And what happens then is they can then continue to invest money, grow the economy, spend money that doesn't actually exist yet based on expected future productivity, which we're really beginning to hit that wall now. You know, the law of diminishing returns, you can't do this forever. It turns out you can do it for a very long time, but not forever. And the only way they could get away with this is because the state stepped in on their behalf and defended, quote, their rights of property against the rights of everyone else. And so they just ended up, you know, through interest and usury and other methods to control most of the economy. And the way they do this is, again, if they themselves had to foot the bill for the protection of the property via their own private purse, they wouldn't be able to have amalgamated complexes of property so vast. They can only have that because the state externalizes that cost through the taxpayer via the police. Their property rights count just as much as yours. But who benefits more? Well, they do, because that's all, you know, they're making bank off that. And, you know, which is ridiculous that they get to make bank off that while we're paying for the protection of their property. So that's one. All sorts of, you know, quote, monopolies they have. They have intellectual property. They have government granted privileges, all these things that they add to this. But the number one thing that they want is the cost, right? There's all these cost inputs that go into production. The easiest cost to lower, and the one that they always try to lower, is personal costs, wages. That's always where they go first, always. You know, in the 1890s, they used to try to employ criminals. And you know, there'd be strikes, and they say, no, you can't apply criminals because they're already in jail. You don't have to pay them a wage. So you're taking non-wage workers, criminals, are taking jobs away from waged workers. So the goal here is to depress wages. Now, this should be patently obvious to all socialists. And let's say that the labor worker value, let's say there's a labor value, call it LV, labor value. If the labor value in terms of now price, because we're in the cash nexus now, they want that as low as possible. Any socialist would want that as high as possible. Because one way to put them out of business is to increase the cost of labor such that they can't operate. And there's only one way to do that. You have to restrict the supply of labor. You have to do that. You have to restrict the supply of labor. And one of the earliest ways that was done was by, you know, having child labor laws, so they couldn't employ children. So that was one thing that we still have. Well, I guess we still have. It's kind of unclear now in certain parts of the country. But what you'll see, though, is right up until like 1980, all socialist and all Marxist parties in the West were anti-immigration. They're all pro-immigration now. I mean, this is literally the stupidest, most insane thing a socialist could do. It's basically saying that a capitalist will just win forever because they'll have a depressed labor supply that's just unable to organize. In my earlier May Day episode earlier this year, I mentioned how Engels said that, the workers can't organize. Diversity of the workforce raises the cost of labor action. Right. So why would anybody support this? A synthetic leftist, right? A nincompoop. Now, this is before, Engels writing well before all this, but feminism is the same thing. Women in the workforce, lower wages, they depress labor. The labor value just gets smashed by this. And again, they also disrupt it. I mean, we have in, was it 1984, Winston Smith, talks about how the women of the party are the most hawkish defenders and the most brain-dead enforcers of it. Yeah, it's a pretty right-wing thing to say for George Orwell. He's got a lot of flack for that in recent times. But again, he knew, this is dangerous. This is not helpful. So if flooding the labor market with women and immigrants increases the unit cost for each laborer to act, this is a losing scenario by definition. Why do socialists support this? Because they're not real socialists, that's why. So let's just follow the theory itself before we get to any of the actual socialists themselves that say some pretty right-wing things. If diversity in the workforce increases the unit labor cost, then you know what you need? You need a homogeneous workforce, which in the European countries, was in the North America, the Anglosphere countries of Canada, United States, Australia, would be white men. And a workforce entirely composed or majority composed of white men. And they knew this. So I'll get to that in a moment too. But so what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like a very different kind of socialism, often associated with Italy and Mean Mr. Mustache and the mid-20th century Germans, which is interesting. Because I think from the years 1917 to 1945, there was a battle over what it meant to be a socialist. And because the Axis powers lost the Second World War, they were just eliminated by default from this game. But, it looks like Mean Mr. Mustache is having his revenge with the rise of third positionism around the world, which is basically just a polite word for fascism. And most modern-day socialists are third positionists, which was sort of what, according to some, he prophesied would happen after he died. The world would recognize that he was right. Well, if by right he means right about socialism, and by that kind of socialism you mean third positionism, maybe. Now, there's the broader strategy that I've repeated many times before, the idea of the national strike by George Sorel. The goal is you want to have full or near full employment with near full or near full union membership. So that when you go on strike and bring the country to its knees, as happened in Russia in the February of 1917 before the Bolshevik counter coup by Wall Street, you win. You just win. And the whole game is over. You don't have any scabs coming in, and assuming you can get the army to stand down, or at least be neutral or be a part of the movement, you win. And they were deathly afraid of that. Part of my speech at the Old Glory Club was that the culture war was invented to win the class war, which it did. Before he died in '76, Phil Oakes said that the whole culture war was a disaster. The radical culture movement was a disaster for the anti-war, anti-Wall Street movement. Because if you're going to organize the country, you don't need all these different cultures. You need one unified culture. I'm like, wow, okay, wow. See, that's what you need. And that's just basically all right coded, right? Pro male, pro white population here in the United States or Europe. Now, that's what I think theory would do. And then you'd win. Because if you envision a world in which Actually, we need to bring up Marx here again for this. Marx. All right. I read this before. This is the 1882 Russian edition preface to the Communist Manifesto. He says, how very different today, precisely European immigration fitted North America for gigantic agricultural production, whose conception is shaking the very foundations of European landed property. Large and small, at the same time, it enabled the United States to exploit its tremendous industrial resources with an energy and on a scale that must shortly break the industrial monopoly of Western Europe and especially of England existing up to now. Both circumstances react in a revolutionary manner upon America itself. Step by step, the small and middle land ownership of the farms, the basis of the whole political constitution, is succumbing to the competition of giant farms. At the same time, a mass industrial proletariat and fabulous concentrations of capital funds are developed for the first time in the industrial regions. And he writes about this as a result of immigration and Europe absorbing North America absorbing the surplus population of Europe. Right, okay, so that's the mechanism. That's the mechanism. Picking people up, moving them around. Picking them up, moving them around. And so they want to have immigration policies that are loose in order for them to do that. Well, again, let's just go pure theory mode. If we had a whole bunch of third positionist socialist countries around the world which had tight immigration restrictions, if enough of the world's countries were those kinds of government, then capitalism would lose because it couldn't import people because the countries they want to be imported from wouldn't allow the emigration of these people. So from a theory point of view, the things that you'd have to do to actually beat capitalism would actually be far more on the right end of the spectrum. So one of the earliest thinkers who influences socialism is Thomas Carlyle. Okay, we got Carlyle here. Cash nexus. Okay, this is from Chartism, 1840. This is from chapter 6, laissez-faire. O reader, to what shifts is poor society reduced, struggling to give still some account of herself in each epoch when cash payment has become the sole nexus of man to man. Chapter 7, not laissez-faire. Cash payment the sole nexus, and there are so many things which cash will not pay. Cash is a great miracle. It has not all power in heaven nor even on earth. Supplying demand will honor also, and yet how many demands are there entirely indispensable, which have to go elsewhere than to the shops and produce quite other than cash before they can get their supply. On the whole, what astonishing payments does cash make in this world? Now, why is Carlyle critical of this? Well, this is something that Carlyle wouldn't have been saying because Baudrillard was long after Carlyle. But what basically the cash nexus does is it creates a push to separate the sign from the signification. So the higher up you go, the simulation hierarchy, it's not pointing to anything whatsoever. So you might look at a church and think it's a place of worship when it's really, like Christ driving out the money changers. It's just a den of robbers and thieves. Or maybe you think, oh, well, this is a family. This is where you have compassion. And no, it's not. It's just cash payment. If kids can't foot the bill, they're going to have to do chores because, hey, you're living in my property rent free. All of these things just completely disintegrate. Romantic relationships disintegrate. You can talk about, the RP talks about that. So from a perspective of the objection here is a right-coded, right-wing objection. All of these normal human experiences that we're supposed to have, we don't. We don't, and it's because the cash system is injected at every point. Now, how does this affect Marx? So this is Friedrich Engels' The Development of Utopian Socialism, where he freely admits this idea comes from Carlyle. He says, the development of industry upon a capitalistic basis made poverty and misery of the working masses conditions of existence of society. Cash payment became more and more, in Carlyle's phrase, see Thomas Carlyle, Past and Present, London, 1843, the sole nexus between man and man. The number of crimes increased from year to year. Formerly, the feudal vices had openly stalked about in broad daylight. Though not eradicated, they are now, at any rate, thrust into the background. In their stead, the bourgeois vices, hitherto practiced in secret, began to blossom all the more luxuriantly. He complains about prostitution. He says marriage itself remained as before, the locally recognized form, the official cloak of prostitution, and moreover was supplemented by rich crops of adultery. So we then see a very interesting thing too, going back to the essay we were reading by, or the Lost Literature of Socialism. This is actually from the book itself by George Watson. And he's leading up to a quote from Engels. The return would be to medieval affluence as they imagined it and to traditional family values. In 1845, in the condition of the working classes in England, Engels had expressed horror at the destruction of married life in the industrial north of England where he lived. It was plainly demoralizing for women to go out to work, he argued, especially when the husband was left unemployed to look after the children and to do the cleaning and the cooking. Gender reversal had no charms for the early socialists. The quote here he uses is not quite correct, so I'm going to go over now to the condition of the working class in England, and I'll quote Engels directly. In many cases, the family is not wholly dissolved by the employment of the wife, but turned upside down. The wife supports the family, the husband sits at home, tends the children, sweeps the room, and cooks. This case happens very frequently. In Manchester alone, many hundred such men could be cited. Condemned to domestic occupations, it is easy to imagine the wrath aroused among the working class men by this reversal of all relations within the family, while the other social conditions remain unchanged. Wow. Could anybody imagine a Marxist or a socialist today having that position? No, you couldn't. That's a very right-wing, right-coded concern here. And this is, and of course, it's a follow-up to an earlier claim he's making that the families get dissolved, because he says in many cases the family is not wholly dissolved. So he's saying that employing women will dissolve the family in many cases or reverse the family roles in others. And this is something that, is to bemoan. So again, we're even the early Marxist feminists, because there's a strong case to be made that they weren't. The Fraud of Feminism by Balfort Bax is an excellent introduction in 1913 to this kind of thinking. And he basically just says it all out, that the goal of feminism is to create a totalitarian system whereby the state can step in at any point along the line to defend milady and just squash opposition. I heard about this from RP guys. So the thing is, though, we hear this now and it's like, wasn't that really weird that the Marxist is RP? But is it? Right? Again, this is all before 1917, all before, according to my theory of history, the counter gang was created with Lenin, and then Lenin and Trotsky. So that's very interesting. And he takes positions that many on the right here would find completely unobjectionable, completely obvious, completely the case. So we also have Jack London and the Iron Heel. And what's interesting here is his main hero. Let's look this up. Everard is described as a Nietzschean Superman. It's like, there we go. He says he was a Superman, a blonde beast such as Nietzsche has described, and in addition, he was aflame with democracy. Now, how did this book get treated by later socialists? Well, Mr. Orwell didn't like it. He has this to say. Where was it? Some violence. Yeah, so he's referring to Jack London. With his, in an intellectual way, London accepted the conclusions of Marxism, and he imagined that the contradictions of capitalism, the unconsumable surplus and so forth, would persist even after the capitalist class had organized themselves into a single corporate body. But temporarily, he was very different from the majority of Marxists, with his love of violence and physical strength, his belief in a natural aristocracy, his animal worship, and his exaltation of the primitive. He had in him what some might fairly call a fascist strain. We already see it here, right? Each iteration of the synthetic left calls the earlier iteration fascist, which is interesting because it's now I'm not saying that prior to 1920 when Mussolini, or 22 when Mussolini comes to power, that these earlier socialists were fascists. No, but I'm saying they were a right-wing reaction to capitalism, of which I think one could plausibly argue fascism and National Socialism were more faithful developments of. And so in order to distance themselves from the Second World War, the synthetic left, as well as earlier socialist writers, just called them fascist. We also have the left SR revolutionary assassin, Boris Savinkov, who, after he failed to stop Lenin, went to Italy and thought that Mussolini was a great guy, thought that he was doing the same kind of revolutionary activity he was. There's some debate over whether George Sorel approved of Mussolini or not. So it does seem there's this interesting like old guard that was like alive, that had been alive in the 19th and then early 20th centuries, which were kind of leaning more towards the fascists than they were to the Bolsheviks, of old guard of socialist movements. So that's very interesting. And again, you just don't hear this in the history books. You don't hear this from the right or the left. And you wouldn't, because as Sutton points out, the capitalist classes in America, along with the synthetic left classes around the world, like in the old Soviet Union, had a vested interest in keeping this secret because both benefited from this deception. Okay, Marx also here talks about the cash payment in the Communist Manifesto. He says, the bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefensible, chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, and brutal exploitation. And so, if we look at this idea of the cash payment, the cash nexus, as Carlyle, Engels, and Marx talk about it, what it does is things like the family, the church, the state, all become facades for this thing, because this thing is still going on behind them. So if you think, if you think that the way things were, a lot of people on the right will say, well, they'll look back and, especially with like RP stuff, you look back in time and it's going to be, oh, it's always been like this. No, it's not always been like this. There's a lot of reasons for that. I'll probably make a future video on why technology radically changed everything. And so, anything before 250 years ago was really different than it is now. But one of those reasons is the cash payment. And the idea of all of this just going to pieces is considered a bad thing by Marx and Engels. The destruction, Engels is bemoaning the fact that the working class men have to stay at home while their women work. That's a right-wing complaint today. You've got Balfort Bax saying that, the feminism is a conspiracy for totalitarian state control. So not only have now that's not to say that it's quite possible Marx and Engels contradict themselves at various points, but what I'm saying is that both the critics of them on the right and their supporters on the left have not read them, because they ignore a lot of this like coded material that's just like, wow, that doesn't really sound left-wing at all, as far as like preserving these older cultural norms to some degree or other, to preserving national identity. I mean, Jack London himself, I was first actually, this entire journey of like right-coded socialism probably began with Countercurrents, because they had articles, I think, every year on the birthday of Jack London or something. And they mentioned that Jack London was like a, race realist socialist. I'm like, oh, that's right. He was. I didn't really read his socialist literature. I read his other more adventure-oriented literature. But yeah, that's definitely his position. And I'm like, but he was the leading American socialist at the time, one of the leading socialists. It's like, well, you can't imagine a socialist like that today. And so I think that what is going on here, it's very complicated. I've talked about parts of this elsewhere, is that from, say, 1800 to 1917, there was this rising anti-capitalist movement, which I argue is from the right. And I think that the real, like the normie, not the normie case, the official case that's been made is George Watson, The Lost Literature of Socialism. I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. And thanks to Keith Preston, he introduced me to Watson. So I'm like, oh, yeah, these actually really dovetail quite nicely. The other thing then being is, what happened? Well, I think that they were winning. I think that they were winning, and that the idea of the national strike was really terrifying to the bourgeoisie, and it worked in Russia in February. So they had to develop plans to dilute it. So as I read the history from the point of view of some of the stuff I've read from Sutton and elsewhere, stage one was create a atrocious boogeyman, right? The Bolsheviks were just gangsters. They created, this is what Noam Chomsky had said, for example, and he's right, that the Soviet Union was just so awful, so terrible. It was great PR for the capitalists who could just say, oh, you want that? That's horrible. That's terrible. You don't want that. And yeah, but how did it come to be? Well, I've already talked at length about this, but Wall Street helped create and support the Soviets from the original October Revolution of 1917 up through the Civil War to Lend-Lease to the Great Grain Robbery of 1973. On and on and on and on and on. It was a conflict, I guess, that was real, but it was simulated in a way that, say, the Second World War was definitely not simulated. That was all hands on deck. So, and then the second stage was where I talked about in my speech, the rise of the culture war, where in the United States proper, where there's a groundswell of the anti-war movement, which is the only movement from the culture war that doesn't really exist anymore. Why is that? Oh, well, because all the others were just plants. That was the real danger. And then there's this book called, let me see, Laurel Canyon. There's that Strange Things in the Valley. Yeah, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan, where he points out that a lot of this hippie stuff was created by the intelligence services to defang the anti-war movement, which it did very well. And so the I guess the takeaway here is, if we look at from the point of view of theory, okay, it's really simple. Capitalism is always about cutting costs. The easiest way to cut costs is to cut personnel, either by just getting rid of them entirely, like say with robots, or depressing labor's value, the LV labor value, by importation of immigrants, by employing criminals, by employing children, by employing women. And even though, and of course, feminism is actually a libertarian ideology, because what does the abortionist say? My body, my choice. That's self-ownership. That's straight up libertarianism. But they all, many of them would line up on the left and say that they were Marxists and socialists for a long time. Maybe not so much now. What they did in practice, whatever they thought they were doing, was depressing the cost of labor, which was harming the socialist cause. Now, were they thinking clearly about this? No. Was that their intention? Probably not. They were just, to quote Lenin, useful idiots, but this time useful idiots for capital. And so this is what that's a strong indicator. There's a Latin term, cui bono, who benefits? Well, clearly capital benefits from the employment of women, not socialism. So the obvious question to then ask is, why are so many socialists advocating this? Oh, maybe because they're plants, or they're dupes or dopes, and that this is actually a synthetic movement. And I think we've seen that come to fruition now, where even anti-war Democrats from the Bush years are now supporting World War III against Russia. Yay. Good job, right? I guess mission accomplished for them. And that means if you want to remove impediments to the cost of labor action, you want homogeneity, right? We have The Verge released a heat map of Whole Foods, where at-risk places of work for unionization are those that are homogeneous. Read white male. So they import women and minorities. I mean, they just tell you this. It's straight up. They don't even hide it. And so it's insane that on the right and the left in the United States today, this kind of like pure theory coding of what actual socialism would have to look like to be real socialism and actually accomplish its goal of ending capital is, to me, just mind-numbing. I don't know how no one's done this. It's crazy. And then, of course, one of the key ideas of socialism is the cash nexus. That goes back to Thomas Carlyle. Carlyle is sort of like a red Tory, I guess you could say, in some cases. You've also got John Ruskin, who's also kind of a red Tory. And even Marx and Engels have some Toryish qualities to them. And then you've got the militant anti-feminist E. Balfort Bax. That's a brilliant book. Everybody should read the Fraud of Feminism. And then you also have Jack London, The Iron Heel. That's his more like overtly socialist work, which is a great novel by itself, but it's definitely not what you would expect if you think of socialism the way we do today. Many of the old guard, earlier socialists who were on the scene before 1917, so before Lenin and Mussolini, many of them, when they had to pick between the two, picked Mussolini. like I said, Boris Savinkov, who was fighting Lenin, and then possibly, though there's some debate, George Sorel, which is really interesting. And it's also really interesting that George Sorel, probably one of the most important socialist theorists, even though he's kind of an anarchist as well. Syndicalism is that weird ideology that like straddles socialism and anarchism. Even though anarchism is a form of socialism, I guess, and in most cases, ANCAPs notwithstanding. So in that case, what you end up having is this really weird blank spot in history where people just don't talk about the fact that, oh yeah, when you had to pick between Mussolini and Lenin, a lot of these guys were like, hey, Mussolini's actually closer to what we were doing than this Lenin guy, which again would support the idea of Lenin being a counter gang. Now, actually, while we have this up, this is not exactly the same thing, but it is related. I have up some stuff from Samuel Gompers talking about Lenin, and it's crazy how people just forgot this. Even Sutton, because I mean, if Sutton had known this, I know he would have quoted Gompers. This is a Commercial Telegraph First Journal. President Gompers of the American Federation of Labor has issued a statement declaring that the recognition by the United States of the Bolshevist tyranny in Russia would be a needless and base betrayal of the civilization. Mr. Gompers further declared that American public life is being flooded with propaganda and that the predatory international finance has its appetite up and believes it sees loot in Russia. We also have Samuel Gompers. Under the caption, Soviet bribe fund, here says Gompers, the New York Times of May 1st, 1922. Where do you want to go? Chicago, April 30th, Associated Press. Samuel Gompers, president of the American Federation of Labor, issued a statement today declaring that recognition by the United States of the Bolshevist tyranny in Russia would be a needless and baseless betrayal of civilization. Declaring that American public life was being flooded with propaganda and that predatory international finance has its appetite up and believes it sees loot in Russia. He asserted that nothing would be more fraught with disaster to humanity than American recognition of the Bolshevist power in any form. Lenin, Samuel Gompers, denounced as a bandit merchant, ready to take what he can get in exchange for the heritage of a people rendered helpless by him and his. Well, there you go. There you go. So this is all very like what I'll say germinal. We're really just at the beginning of this. This is a kind of conclusion one only gets to when one is like just digested all of the 20th century's history about socialism, fascism versus communism, Wall Street, all of this, and finding the glitches like Sutton does, and putting all those glitches together to get a more accurate picture of what's going on. So to wrap it all up, in summary, I think early socialism was a right-wing reaction to capitalism, and that a counter gang was created in the Soviet Union with Smoking Gun being Lenin arrested in Halifax on the SS Christiana Ford in the spring of 1917, and then released with the intervention of MI6 Cloud Dancy. Smoking Gun. But then we also have other smoking guns, like the financial paper trail that Sutton has pointed to, which then indicates that strongly indicates that the Soviet Union was a counter gang intended to make all of this look bad. Mussolini once famously said, it was about Stalin. Is Stalin actually a fascist? He's killed more communists than I have. Stalin's another question entirely. Okay, so two, a lot of the old guard who were before the shift to the Lenin-Mussolini debate over the future of socialism, seem to have supported Mussolini, which is also very interesting, further strengthening the case for the idea that this was a counter gang. And then it really was solved on the battlefields of Europe in 1930s and 40s, just eliminating that other group entirely. And then in the United States, what was left of that group was subtly hollowed out by the culture war, until all that you had left was this mutant hydra called the synthetic left, the woke, whatever, which grew out of the labor movement, the anti-war movement, but it now doesn't represent any of those values. So, yeah, that's the hot take for the night. So let's see what we got. Wandering Panda, happy to see you here. XD Poking, Title 8 states that if wages are proven to be suppressed by immigration, it can be valid reasons for deportation of legal government workers in that sector. Interesting. North Sea, good evening. Tricky Wood, hello. Imperator of Forge. Socialism took root and came of age in the backdrop of the Age of Romanticism, which was a direct reaction to the Enlightenment and French Revolution. Imperator of Forge, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' works could easily read as influenced by Carlyle and his critique of industrial capitalism. Even Southerners like George Fitzhugh was anti-capitalist to some extent. M3T4PHYZX. Great topic, banger stream, cheers. Thank you. Imperator Forge. Socialism originated in Britain, largely has a reaction among labor unions to lowering income and raise taxes. Labor unions have been around since the early 1700s. Right. Imperator Forge, National Socialism, and Soviet state Marxism, Leninism would have more in common with one another than they do differences. It is just some are ethnocentric or some are civic. Right. Mussolini was more civic. For example, he had a Jewish mistress and dragged his feet when Hitler was going after the Jews. Caleb Moppin, happy to see you here. This is important info. All conservatives need to hear this. I very much agree. Imperator of Forge. Communism was invented by bankers in Wall Street and by agents in London and Paris to make capitalism more appealing. Yeah, and some of the European financiers are exposed in Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. Imperator of Forge. I think Russians today are only beginning to wake up to what was done to them in the last century, though Putin doesn't want to fully come over to what happened. Yeah, I don't think Putin does, but I don't know about Russians in general. I hope so. Wow. All right, everybody. That was a good stream. A lot of really happy to see Caleb in the chat. That was cool. And yeah, that's all we got for tonight, guys. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Till next week. Bye-bye.